Council. I am Irina Grosu, Director of the Center for Human Dignity here at FRC. Whether you are joining us in person or by webcast, I promise that you are in for a treat and a powerful, personal story about love, redemption, anger, shame, faith, and forgiveness. Our policy lecture today is entitled, "You Carried Me, A Daughter's Memoir," after Melissa Ohden's autobiography, which has been recently published. Melissa Ohden is a survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion in 1977. Despite the initial concerns regarding Melissa's future after surviving the attempt on her life at approximately 7 months gestation, she has not only survived, but thrived. With a master's degree in social work, she has worked in the fields of substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence, sexual assault counseling, and child welfare. Melissa was formerly a college outreach speaker with Feminists for Life and is the former patron of Real Choices Australia. She has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate and the Australian Parliament. Melissa is on the board of directors for the Vitae Foundation, a national organization which uses media to advance a culture of life. In 2012, Melissa founded the Abortion Survivors Network, which seeks to educate the public about failed abortions and survivors while providing emotional, mental, and spiritual support to abortion survivors. Since its inception, Melissa has been in contact with over 209 survivors. Melissa has been featured on television and radio programs, including Fox News and EWTN. Without further ado, please help me welcome Melissa Ohden.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I was just sitting in my seat going, well, it's obvious that anonymity is a thing of the past for me, really, isn't it? It's a good thing I gave that up a long time ago. It's interesting. Irina and I were chatting a little bit before I started, and this is an interesting journey for somebody like me. And one of the questions that I often get from the media, whether they are pro-abortion or pro-life, is, why don't more survivors tell their story? And there are lots of reasons why other survivors don't tell their story. As you heard in my introduction, I've had contact actually now with 210, the number went up one, 210 other survivors. And by and large, most of those survivors will never tell their story publicly, whether it's because of how it might impact their biological family, maybe their adoptive family. I know an awful lot of survivors who feel like they can't put their professional lives at risk by coming forward publicly with their stories. And a lot of the survivors simply cannot face the public ridicule that often comes with sharing a story like ours. Every single day I wake up to news and comments about me, like things like, oh, she must be lying. She wanted to be famous, right? This couldn't have happened to her. Or, some of my other favorites. So her birth mother didn't have a choice, and so now she wants to take away our choice. Those are many of the reasons why survivors will likely never come forward with their story. But what I'm hoping is that as I advocate for lives like ours to be protected and respected, I'm hoping that other survivors watch me doing this and realize, what, I'm still standing. Every single day, no matter what people want to say, I'm still standing. And so if I can do it, they can too. And so that is my sincerest hope, that other survivors or other people who are touched by abortion, men and women who are post-abortive, maybe they will find their own courage in the midst of their devastation and be willing to help us have this open dialogue about what abortion has truly done in our lives. As you can see in my presentation, my memoir, as Irina discussed, You Carried Me, was just recently released. It was actually released on Monday, and is already a bestseller on Amazon. So many thanks to all of you. We are greatly appreciative of that. But this story is the story of my life. And I often joke and say it's a wild one. It's not enough that I survived a saline infusion abortion, but it also is a story that involves a forced abortion, a child who gets to journey and search for her biological parents. And so I want to start 39 years ago with my story. In 1977, my biological mother was faced with her own unplanned pregnancy. And what I know about my birth mother is that she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. My birth mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father, but they were engaged, and they were madly in love with each other. And sadly, my biological mother was forced into a saline infusion abortion. Many of you remember the saline infusion abortion from the 1970s. I think I heard you guys talking about it even here today. That saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding the preborn baby in the womb. And the intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison the child, to scald them from the outside in. Typically, that procedure lasted about 72 hours. The child soaked in it. Their life was snuffed out in the womb. And then premature labor would be induced with the intent of that deceased child being delivered. In my own circumstances, my medical records actually indicate that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5. They tried numerous times over those 5 days to induce my birth mother's labor with me. And I often joke I'm a little bit stubborn, and I wasn't going anywhere. And as much as I can joke about that, the reality is that I was soaking in that toxic salt solution for even longer than what I was intended to through that procedure. You know, when most people hear that my birth mother was forced into that abortion, I know people start wondering, right, who would it have been that would have forced that upon her? People who know my story know who it was. But maybe like other people, maybe you're thinking, oh, could it have been her biological father? We know men play a very important role in this. But it actually wasn't my biological father. It was my own grandmother, my birth mother's mother. She was a prominent nurse in the little community in Iowa that they were living in, had a relationship with a local abortionist, and sadly that gave her the opportunity to make this secret forced abortion take place on my own biological mother. After my birth mother and I were subjected to that toxic salt solution for 5 days, finally on that 5th day they succeeded in inducing her labor. And one of the first things I was told as I pieced together the events of my life is that when I was delivered at St. Luke's Hospital, they believed, of course, that the abortion had succeeded in ending my life and that I would be delivered as a deceased child. But unfortunately, you know, when I survived and was born alive, I was told that the abortionist made the demand that I be left there to die. In recent years, what I've actually uncovered is that it wasn't the abortionist who made that demand about my life. Maybe you've already guessed who it might have been. It was my grandmother, the nurse. Once again, not only did she force this abortion upon my biological mother, but coming face to face with her firstborn grandchild, she still demanded that I be left in that room to die. And sometimes people look at me and say, "Oh, Melissa, how could anybody do such a thing? Your own grandmother." There are grandparents and aunts and uncles and friends and family members, members of the clergy who are making life and death decisions about lives like mine every single day. They may not be in the hospital room when that child is born alive like me, but there are people who are making influential decisions every single day. It just happened to be my grandmother, and it just happened to be in that hospital room after I survived. In recent months, what I actually learned is that after my grandmother made that demand about my life, a nurse took me from that hospital room and rushed me to the nursery, believing that if somehow other people at the hospital found out that the abortion didn't succeed in ending my life, that they would fight for medical care to be provided to me. And they did. I'm here today because those medical professionals intervened in my life. It's like something out of a movie, right? It is. The little girl who should have been killed, the little girl who was then should have been left to die. People fight for me. But I think all of us, as we work in this field and we are battling for life, we know stories in some way, shape, or form that have storylines like this, right? And those nurses fought for me. You would never know by looking at me today, right? That I was subjected to that toxic salt solution, that I should have been delivered dead, that I was initially told that I should be left to die. You would never know. But I weighed a little less than 3 pounds when I survived that abortion. I was 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which actually indicated to the medical professionals that my birth mother was much further along than the 20 weeks that the abortionist wrote on the medical records. And one of the first notations in my medical records by a neonatologist is that I looked like I was about 31 weeks gestational age when I survived. Those medical records are actually included in my book that we released. And I'm thankful for that, because I think that is one of the most powerful tools we have in our culture today to say, this is what it looks like, and let's have a conversation. But here I was, about 31 weeks gestational age. I suffered from severe respiratory problems, liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. And the doctors indicated they didn't think I would live for very long. And if I did live, I would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout my life, ranging from blindness and deafness to having emotional and mental disabilities. And I am so thankful that no matter what the doctor said about what my life was going to look like, my adoptive parents didn't hesitate for a second to open their hearts and their home to me. I was lying in an incubator. Let's see if I can get this to work. That is me. And that's what my parents came face to face with, my adoptive parents, my mom and dad, as I like to call them. That's who they came face to face with for the first time. I was still in the NICU at the University of Iowa hospitals. And my parents often tell the story of how that first time they laid eyes on me, they fell in love with me. And I like to remind people that's also why I do what I do. And I'm pretty sure why all of us do what we do, right? I believe every child deserves the opportunity to have someone fall in love with them. I believe every parent deserves the opportunity to fall in love with their child. I think that's the primary work of pregnancy centers in particular. They are allowing parents, adoptive or biological, this great opportunity to fall in love with their children, often in ways that they probably didn't expect that they could. And so it is a love story. And I know my parents' love and their faith truly helped heal me. I went home to my family less than 3 months after I survived that failed abortion. That's pretty miraculous stuff, especially 39 years ago. And I also know it's the love of the medical professionals who cared for me. I've met a couple of them personally. I know how those nurses in the NICU gave me a name when I was left nameless for those months. My name was initially Katie Rose. I know how they knitted me clothing and booties that I still have in my possession today, how they fed me from a bottle even when the doctors told them not to do it yet, because they loved me and they believed in me. And I always like to remind people, if they're wondering how to get involved in pro-life work and wondering how to make a difference, honestly, that's right where we start. It's about loving people where they're at, loving them in the circumstances that they're in. And it's transformational. And I grew up in a home knowing I was adopted. That was normal to me. My adoptive parents struggled with infertility for over 15 years. And so I have an older sister who's adopted from another family. And then they adopted me no matter what they were told my life was going to look like. And then, of course, in true God fashion, right, after 15 years of infertility, along came my little brother. Yes, and you guys all realize he is not adopted. And we thought that was funny at our house, right? We thought he was the odd man out. We were thinking, why would you do that? Because look at how good this adoption situation turned out for you 2 times in a row, right? That's what we were thinking as children. And my brother does tell some funny stories about that. They're probably true. They're true. And, my sister and I felt so loved and so special because our parents did a beautiful job of helping us know that adoption meant that we were loved, and not just by them and not just by God, but our biological parents loved us. They loved us so much that they placed us for adoption when they couldn't care for us. And that's what I knew growing up, and I was so thankful for that. But all of that changed when I was 14 years old. That's when I found out the story of my survival. And I think if you're like most people, right, you hear the words 14 and you go, oh, why would anybody tell you at the age of 14? Isn't it hard enough to be 14, right? You're right. But it wasn't my parents' plan for me to find out at 14. It really wasn't their plan for me to find out ever, because they were afraid of how the truth was going to change my life. And so they kept it a secret. But when I was 14, a very unplanned, unexpected kind of thing happened at our house. My older sister faced her own unplanned pregnancy as a high school student. And God used that as an opportunity to bring the story of my survival to light. In the book, I actually detail it. It was during an argument with my sister that she said the words to me. She said, Melissa, at least my biological parents wanted me. And I was thinking, isn't that an interesting thing to say? We were both equally wanted, right? We were both placed for adoption. Our families loved us. What I didn't know is that she knew something about my life that I didn't know. When my sister found herself with that unplanned pregnancy, she told our parents and let them know she was considering all of her options. Even though we were raised in a home to know about the sanctity of life and the gift of adoption, she had all of those fears that so many women do. But I'm thankful that she was not too scared to tell our parents. And when she told them that, they decided to tell her the story of my survival. They were hoping she would understand the depths of that decision she was considering. So when she blurted those words out that night, at least my parents wanted me, it's because she knew something that I didn't. And so I waited up for our mom that night, asked her to explain to me why. Why would she suddenly be saying things like this? And that night, my mom had to speak the words that changed my life. And gratefully now they've changed the world. But she said, Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. And that night, the world stopped spinning. Lots of people ask me, didn't you experience this great joy knowing that God had a plan for you? Yes, I knew in that moment of time God had a very specific plan for me. But I think it's sometimes really hard to embrace our purpose when we're in the midst of pain. And I was in pain that night, and I was in pain for many nights thereafter. In my book, I actually detail it more than I've ever spoken about before. I went through years during my teenage years suffering with an eating disorder, alcohol abuse, poor relationships, because I didn't want to be this person. I didn't want to be the abortion survivor. I didn't want to feel the pain that I felt knowing that somebody had tried to end my life. So I did everything I could to distance myself from that. And as hard as it is to look back on those years, I also know that all of us, I think, walk through some similar paths in our lives. You may not know what it's like to be an abortion survivor, but I think we all have things that we try to run away from in our lives. And those were some important years in my life because I had to learn to fully trust in God and recognize that his plans for me were much greater than some of the choices that I made in my life, and that I don't have to apologize for being me. And God makes no mistakes. And I needed to accept what had happened in my life. And so really God put me forward on the path to move, to search, and find the truth about my life. I first forgave my biological parents so long ago that I can't even tell you when it was. But I think forgiveness is a lifelong journey. I think we all have to make that decision every single day to forgive, and to forgive again and again and again. And so God really placed it on my heart, even as a teenager, that I needed to let my biological parents know that I'm alive and well, and I'm not angry and I'm not bitter. And so I started looking for them when I was 19, started trying to obtain my medical records about the same time. I often joke, this is not what I planned on doing with my life. Anybody else ever lived through that? You probably have too, right? As Irina discussed in my introduction, I have a master's degree in social work. I worked in the public and private sector for many, many years. I was the woman climbing the corporate ladder, right? On the outside, people thought I had the perfect life. But what I knew all along was that God was calling me forward to do this. And so searching for my biological parents, trying to obtain my medical records, that was all part of the process that I started taking, knowing that someday God was calling me forward to do this. I didn't find my biological parents or my medical records until I was about 30 years old. It was in 2007 that I finally obtained my medical records, finally found my biological family. And my book, You Carried Me, really details, what an interesting journey that was for about 11 years. And so part of the work I actually do now is I help other abortion survivors and even adoptees search for biological family or try to obtain their medical records, because I learned a lot in those 11 years. And actually, a survivor that I worked with in the last couple years did obtain their medical records after we worked so very hard to find them. So even though she doesn't speak publicly yet, and if she's watching this, she knows I'm talking to her, those are powerful because they speak to us the truth about our own lives, and that is powerful. But I searched for 11 years before I ultimately found the truth, and that's where it gets even more interesting. During the midst of searching, I ended up moving to Sioux City, Iowa, the very same city where my birth mother's abortion had taken place. But I didn't think for a second that it would play a huge part in my future. And to be honest, I actually always questioned over the years if maybe, just maybe, the abortion didn't occur there, right? I knew that maybe people wouldn't want to share all of the truth. And so maybe the abortion didn't even take place there. But in 2007, when I finally obtained my medical records, which you can see in the picture section, I see Irina looking at it right now. My medical records, in them, they say things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? In a world that doesn't want to talk about what abortion is, my medical records are pretty clear. And even in one other spot of my medical records, it lists a complication of pregnancy as a saline infusion. You could say that it complicated things, right? That'd probably be the understatement of the year. But when I was reading through those medical records, at that time, I had not found my biological family yet. But when they sent me those medical records, they committed a huge HIPAA violation. Y'all can see where this is going, right? I simply call it divine intervention. I mean, seriously, after almost 11 years of searching, I obtained my medical records, and in one little spot, they forget to black out my birth parents' names. That's Jesus in my book, most definitely. I could not do things my way, and so he allowed the truth to come forward. And, as I kind of grappled with that of, reading how I fought for my life and the medical care that was provided to me, and then the shock of finding my biological parents, their names, I started searching that same night on the internet. And you're never going to guess what I discovered. I was living in the same city as my biological father. He had grown up there. He had went away to college but came back to that community. And so here I had been living in the same city as my biological father for about 6 years before I had found him. And after so many years of searching, I suddenly didn't know what to do, and I prayed about it and kept hearing the message, Melissa, you need to contact him. It's time. And so I sent my biological father a letter back in 2007 to his office and not his home. I didn't know if he'd ever told his family about me, and I thought that might protect him a little bit. And so in that letter, I told him, all the things I've told you all today. I'm alive and well. I know the truth about my life. I'm not angry. I'll be waiting in the very same city if you ever want to have contact or have a relationship with me. And I never heard back from him. And I was somewhat expecting that. I was given many years to prepare for that. But it was difficult initially. It brought up all those old feelings of being unworthy, unloved. Nobody wants to hear from you, right? Melissa, you just need to go away. And, I had to learn to make peace with that and trust that God had a plan. And as I talk about in the book, as the months passed, I actually learned that there was a very big reason why my birth father never replied to my letter. He ended up passing away about 6 months after I sent it to him. And it was almost to the very day of the Roe versus Wade anniversary decision that my birth father passed away. To me, that is not a coincidence, as none of these things ever are. And I only discovered that because I had been out in D.C. and I had developed over the course of months a kind of bad habit of Googling my birth father's name on the internet. My husband's an IT guy. Honey, if you're watching, I do listen to you, and hopefully more than what I used to, right? Because back then, right, my husband had warned me and said, Melissa, I know that this is your way of trying to stay up on what is happening in his life, but one of these times you're going to come across something you wish you hadn't. And he was right. because that time when I opened the hit from the local newspaper, I found his obituary. And even though I'm blessed with my amazing parents, my adoptive family, I grieved that loss of my biological father. And I thought all of the answers I was searching for must be gone, right? And I know you're all staring intently at that picture thinking, it's not him. You're right, that's not my biological father. But when my biological father passed away, what I never could have imagined is that when they went to clean out his office, they found my letter, tucked in his top desk drawer. And that's how his family learned the great secret that he had carried throughout his life. You know, in reality, I now suspect that my biological father never even knew that I survived. Can you imagine receiving that letter? You know, I was hoping that it wouldn't shock him. I didn't know all of these details back then, but I am thankful that he received that letter. Maybe it gave him some peace before his life ended. But he ultimately gave me an incredible gift in his passing. As I was looking for his family after he passed away, they came looking for me. And that's actually the man that you see on the screen. That's my biological father's father. So my paternal grandfather. I've been so blessed now for almost the last 9 years to have my grandfather and my great aunt from my birth father's side of the family involved in my life. And I know that this is not easy for them. You know, there are a lot of answers that may never come. And my sincerest hope has always been that I can make good out of all the bad things that have been done in our lives. You know, before I learned that my birth father had passed away in 2007, I started searching for my biological mother. I actually couldn't find her through my searching, but I found her parents. You remember that grandmother that I told you all about? I didn't know back then about the huge role my grandmother had played in the abortion taking place. And so I sent them a letter that summer of 2007, again, kind of telling them all the things I told my biological father and asking for them to reach out to my birth mother on my behalf, never expecting to hear back from them, right? But within just a few days, my grandfather responded to my letter. In his letter, one of his very first statements was that he knew I knew my live birth was not the intention that day. And I think that was very courageous of him. And, you know, sadly, he went on in his letter to let me know that my messages would not be passed along to my biological mother because they were completely estranged from one another. And I could feel something in my heart back then. I didn't understand it, but I understand it now, and maybe you do too, right? When we know how that abortion was forced upon my biological mother, it makes great sense that their relationship was forever changed. And that's part of the message that I share with the world. Abortion isn't just about ending one person's life. It changes people's lives forever. The women and the men, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles, the cousins, the siblings. It changes relationships for generations. And I truly believe that that is what it's going to take to change our culture, is that we need to have a conversation. We need to initiate healing for everyone who is impacted by an abortion. And so that's a huge part of what I try to do. But my grandparents, that was the last time I heard back from them, was in 2007. That's also when I came forward publicly for the first time. As you heard in my introduction, I was a former college outreach speaker with Feminists for Life of America, because I thought, why not start small, right? I had never shared my story publicly before, and the very first time I came out and gave a briefing on Capitol Hill, because that's a friendly place for somebody like me, isn't it? And I'll be honest, I was out there thinking, thank you, but I am never doing this again, right? I went home and told my husband, thank you, Jesus, for the opportunity, but I am not a public speaker. I am a social worker. I have a bundle of nerves, every excuse in the book, right? And it didn't take my husband and I long to actually figure out it wasn't a bad case of nerves that first time I spoke publicly. I actually had a really bad case of morning sickness with that child that you see on the screen. She thinks it's funny too, right? That's our daughter, our oldest, Olivia. She will be 9 in April, and then we have a 2.5-year-old Ava. And it's so funny. I was looking through some old notes the other day, and I can't remember what year it was, maybe 2012, 2013. FRC did a little piece before the March for Life where they wanted you to kind of show a picture of you long ago and the way you were now. And I came across a picture of Olivia kind of striking a pose with her ultrasound photo. And she was just kind of prancing about. And, the message was if my birth mother, or if my mother's life would have been ended by that abortion, I would not be alive today. And as I was preparing to come here actually this week, Olivia said, Mom, I think I'm going to be doing that stuff one of these days soon too. And I said, what are you going to talk about? And she said, oh, I can't even really get into it. I have a lot that I can tell people. So, I think given her humble beginnings, we all know where she's headed. So if we don't finish this fight, I'm pretty sure she will finish it for us. But it was during my pregnancy with her that I got involved in pro-life work. I ultimately gave up my career to accept my calling, and I'm thankful for the opportunities that I've been given. I have been working now in pro-life ministry since 2010, and as you heard in my introduction, I travel not only around the United States, but really throughout the world in defense of life. We were so blessed to be in Ireland this summer for their rally and do lots of press about the Eighth Amendment, which I hold close to my heart, and I will fight with Ireland to protect that and to protect life. But I kind of got to this place in my life where I let the piece about searching for my biological family go. I knew that I may never have the opportunity to meet my biological mother or communicate with her. But in 2013, a member of her family contacted me. It was a cousin. And my cousin is the one who told me about the abortion being forced, my grandmother being a part of it. And she was so gracious enough to open the lines of communication between my half-sisters. I have 2 half-sisters on my birth mother's side of the family. And over time, she also opened the lines of communication with my biological mother. And as you can imagine, those were some pretty difficult conversations to have, even by email. But there was one big reason why they were so difficult. And that is because there was one final secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that's that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life, 30 years, believing that I had died that day at the hospital. Some of you are probably figuring out the more I learn about my life, the more questions I have, right? And you are probably right there alongside with me. How does she get placed for an adoption if her birth mother didn't even know that she survived? That's a pretty big question. And I don't have a concrete answer to that. But what I do know is that my birth mother's signature, when she looks at it on those papers, she doesn't see that as her signature. Whether it was completely forged, whether it was done under duress and not letting her know what she was signing, I don't have an answer to that. But what I do know is that she didn't know that I survived. And really the only reason why she found out is because I had come forward publicly, I had contacted her family, and the secrets started coming out. And I'm thankful that my biological family has been as courageous as they have been to share the truth with me, because it's further emboldened and strengthened me in a big way. But, my birth mother didn't know. And what I often remind people, because people say, gosh, she has to experience great joy knowing that you're alive. Well, that's right, she does. And if you're tuning in, I thank you to my biological mother for all of the communication and your love and your support. But the fact that I'm alive doesn't change what was done to her. The fact that I'm alive doesn't change what was done to me. We cannot negate those things. And so this has been a long journey for her. But we spent about 3 years of our lives really starting to pass along information, getting to know each other, and forge a relationship. And so one of the chapters that I never expected to be in my memoir is the chapter where I met my biological mother. That happened just late this past spring. And people often ask me, what was that like for you? And the short version of that would be, it was everything I ever could have expected and more. And my biological mother and I have a beautiful relationship. I think I'm one of the most blessed people in the world, right? Not only am I alive and I have this gift of my adoptive family, but I also now have this amazing gift of my biological family. And my birth mother, on those days where I felt like maybe I can't share parts of this story, it's way too personal, it's really complicated, right? My birth mother is the one who has urged me on and said, Melissa, I need you to keep doing this. You are the very first person to fight for me. And so I will fight for her. And I will fight for the women like her and the men like my biological father and the children just like me and the future generations to come through every life, right, that is impacted by abortion. So in short, that is the story of my life. And it's interesting, right? Because the story of my life could have been very simple. Just another life ended by abortion. But instead, what God has given me is this amazing story of survival and restoration and redemption and reconciliation. And so I am thankful for the opportunities that I've been given. I want to touch just briefly before we move to question and answer. I want to talk a little bit about other abortion survivors because I think that's a huge part of this equation. I am not the only survivor. Gianna Jessen, of course, lots of people know Gianna. That was life-changing for me to know that there was at least one other person like me in the world. But I spent years of my life in isolation thinking that nobody must understand or I must be some kind of, strange situation, right? And what I found is that other survivors have felt the same way. When I started speaking publicly, I started getting messages from people who would say, "Oh, I'm a survivor too. I've always thought I was the only one." And so that is part of the reason why I formed the Abortion Survivors Network, to provide support to survivors, let them know they're not alone, allow them the opportunity to connect with others who know what it's like to live in these shoes, give them the opportunity to share their story in whatever way, shape, or form that is, and get involved, maybe even just in their local community if that's something that interests them. But in the same time, we are also educating the public about how abortions fail. Children like me go on. One of the most common complaints about me is that I look too normal. I know some of you are thinking the same thing, right? I know. It's okay. I joke about it, right? People go, "Oh, she looks so normal." My apologies. It wasn't my plan, right? It was someone else's plan. But what people don't recognize is that we are truly your neighbor, we're your coworker. I know people who were in the CIA, worked for the White House, prominent businessmen. There are lots and lots of people who have an abortion survivor story that you will never know of. So that's powerful. Some of the survivors that you might know who speak publicly, the top one is Claire Colwell. Claire is a twin survivor. Claire lives in Texas. She actually was united with her biological mother a few years back, and that's how she actually learned that she was a twin survivor. She did not know before that. Let's go back to that. The one on the left, it's a tough picture to see, but that's a young man named Josiah Presley. And if you can see closely enough, he is missing part of his arm. And so he was adopted from a family in the United States. I can't remember where Josiah is from originally, if it was China or Korea. But Josiah is a survivor of an abortion, and you'll catch some videos of him on YouTube. He's done some great, powerful videos. One of them is called Listen to the Beat. I had to stop and think for a second. Listen to the Beat. It's a pretty powerful one that I often share with youth that uses drumming, and each drum hit is indicative of a life ended by abortion every single day in the U.S., and he speaks in that and shares his story. It's really, really powerful. And of course, everybody knows Gianna too. Gianna survived the same type of procedure that I did, and we're just a few months apart in age. I like to think God knew what he was doing quite clearly. And I just want to end by talking a little bit about the power of our stories. Sometimes people say, that's so great. They're a survivor. They have a story. Somebody patted me on the head once and said, "Good for you." No? Thank you. Thank you. Life is good. Being alive is good. Having a mission is good. But I truly believe that abortion survivors are a powerful part of the pro-life movement and changing the culture of death to a culture of life. And some of the ways that we do that, we humanize the preborn. I think we're in a place now where people cannot look at the scientific truth about life or those of us as survivors and go, "It's not human." What I saw since the Center for Medical Progress videos came out is a lot of people now are going, "Yeah, you know what? We know it's a human. And so what?" As hard as it is to hear those things, I think that it's incredibly powerful that we know that we're at this point in time, right? Where we don't have to hide behind rhetoric or words. We see the truth about life And so let's talk about it. Let's protect it. Let's fight for it. But we humanize the preborn and we humanize the issue. You know, one of my friends posted on Facebook this morning, bringing the political debate to life, literally. I said, thank you. I think I'll borrow that term. It's true, right? We're bringing the political debate to life, whether we want to or not. You know, I wish this wasn't a political issue. I was looking at a baby at the airport last night, watching him giggle and look at somebody, and I looked at him for a moment and went, man, I wish I didn't have to do this. Does anybody else do that sometimes, right? I'm looking at this precious baby going, come on. Sometimes I think, I can't believe I have to stand up and fight for the fact that children like me need to live. I cannot believe I have to stand up and fight for children like me to be provided medical care. But guess what? I do. We all have to do it. And so we humanize the issue in a big way. Apparently, my slides are being strange. I'm glad it lasted till the end. The other pieces that I have in there are inspiring, bringing hope, and encouraging healing for post-abortive recovery. To me, that is a huge piece of this puzzle. Long before I met my biological mother, I had a heart for women and men who are impacted by abortion to know that there is hope and healing and love and forgiveness to be found after an abortion. And so abortion survivors are these very important tools when it comes to recovery. You don't know how many times women have contacted me and said, could you be my baby? Are you mine? And nothing is harder for me than to say, I know that I'm not. But what I can do is say, but I love you anyway. I love you anyway. And what can I do to help you? You are loved and you are forgiven. And we can all do that. And so, you know, when we look at how many lives we've lost to abortion, 58 million, right, approximately in the last 44 years. Think about that in terms of not only one life, but future generations to come like my children. The men, the women, the grandparents, the siblings, the aunts and uncles, the doctors, the nurses that are involved. The number grows and grows and grows, right? How many hundreds of millions of people have been impacted by abortion in 44 years? That's why healing is such an important part of this journey that we are on to restoring a culture of life. So I just want to thank you all for being here in person today and all of you tuning in. And I know we're going to turn now to some question and answer. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I know nobody ever wants to be the first one, right?
I know you talk a lot about the different people that are impacted by abortion and abortion survival. What would you say resources are out there for men that are, whether they're birth fathers or grandfathers? I know there's obviously not as many resources out there for them. So what are some suggestions that you have?
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I mean, first of all, I think pregnancy centers are starting to involve men as much as they can. You know, first of all, providing mentors to men. And hopefully, you know, what I typically see with pregnancy centers is that they will pair up a man with clergy in the area who can help walk them through that. There have been, and maybe you guys can remember the name of it, there's Men in Abortion. I should know who it is. I feel terrible. Again, if you're tuning in, my apologies. Send us the link, right? But the truth is, right, as I'm not able to remember it, the reality is most of us don't remember what resources exist because there are so few. And so I think that's, whether it's Silent No More, you know, there are some opportunities, but I think that is a huge missing link. And unfortunately, what I typically hear from men, right, is I've been told not to get involved. I've been told this was not my decision to make anyway. I shouldn't be hurting, right? Because it wasn't my decision. It's her choice. And so we have all these men who are suffering and often in silence. Does anybody remember that resource that I can't think of? Oh, good. I'm not the only one.
Hello, John Murdoch with Hand on Global University. I'm curious, have you had any contact with the grandmother? Is she still living? How has that piece played out?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, my grandmother that was the nurse that forced the abortion is no longer alive. And it sounds silly, right, that I get choked up about this. One of my prayers every single day is that somehow she knew that I loved her and that I share our story not to judge her or to condemn her, But because I truly believe that I need to repay evil with good in this world, that is what the Lord does. And so I am living this life out. And so that truly has been my sincerest prayer over the years. And yeah, I think people don't expect that. I don't think people expect that at all. And I know that so many people, like my grandmother, have their own experience. And my prayer is that anybody who has been involved in an abortion decision for anyone, that they find that healing in their lives also. I can't imagine what drove her to that place in her life. And I can't imagine what her life was like after that day.
Melissa, can you expound a little bit about the media's response to you, and also talk about what you would want the media to know about you and other abortion survivors?
Oh, how much time do we have? Oh, yeah, no. You know, it's interesting, right? Just this week, the book was released this week. And, you know, thankfully, Good Housekeeping and Women's Day magazines did run some kind of, you know, like as told as stories online. And I think that was courageous of them. But of course, we can't control the comments that take place, right? Or maybe why they asked for that story in the first place. I always have to believe in my heart that they're doing it for the right reasons, and that God always uses those stories for good, no matter how it gets slanted. But by and large, the media does not respond to requests to share stories like mine. You know, when Gianna and I testified before Congress back in 2015, I think it was the Los Angeles Times that put survivors in air quotes. They say things like, they allege, right after I showed my medical records to members of Congress. I mean, come on. So I understand it, though, you know, and I was just speaking to Teresa Tomeo about this the other day. Even though we know who the creator is of those lies, right? It is the enemy. This is spiritual warfare. This is a battle. But the media has engaged in this for a long time, too. They silence stories like mine. They want to shame and silence and scare other survivors into not sharing their stories when they do the air quotes and allegations. And so, you know, my hope is that other survivors do find strength in that and know that no matter what the media wants to say about us or how they try to avoid us, our stories, our lives have meaning and merit. And they're powerful. That's why they don't want to talk about it.
You talk about how people are afraid to come out when they have survived abortions, people at very high professional levels. Can you share some consequences of people who have come out, or what they may be facing or worrying about legitimately, that they'll be maybe assumed to be an activist, or that they'll lose their connections and their future, and they'll have a lot to give up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I often remind people that I made a huge sacrifice in coming forward publicly. Even though I know that this is what my life was spared for, this is what I'm called to do. You know what? I made a huge sacrifice in my career, and even just having a personal life, right? My life is now very public. I didn't, you know, I kind of joked at the beginning, I have no anonymity anymore. And I think that's a very scary place to be for a lot of people. And even if they don't have a substantiated concern that they're going to lose their career, you know, what I often hear from male survivors in particular is that when they've shared their story with someone personally, or maybe a colleague of theirs, the typical response is, oh, well, I'm sorry that happened, but we don't want to talk about this. Right? You don't want to talk about this. And I actually got that response myself when I was in college. You know, people would say, well, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but it doesn't mean you have to be pro-life. And so when we even get that on a personal level, whether there is that substantiated fear that maybe you are at risk in your career, right? These kind of personal attacks build on each other. And so people are fearful after sharing their story personally if somebody responds that way. You know, I can honestly say for myself, I was a counselor before I started sharing my story publicly. And for me, I had to make the decision that I would not provide counseling anymore because I was public. And I didn't want that to be an issue, you know, that people thought that I was using my position to influence people, or that I couldn't be a successful counselor. And so even if it isn't, you know, maybe through their boards or something like that, there is definitely, you have to look at every angle and possible conflicts that take place. But personally, it's just very, very hard to even tell people the story. I always wonder, what am I going to do after this, right? I think I'll be okay.
I just want to say thanks for coming and sharing today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm curious about the hospital. St. Luke's, physician, Christian hospital. How has been your relationship with them? Is there a policy to still provide abortions? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of those things that I grappled with over the years. I kept thinking, a hospital? How could that have happened, right? This can't be right. I had to have been maybe sent to that hospital, right? That made sense in my mind. And that's kind of the typical response I even get from people today, right? Well, you must have just been sent there. Well, no, what we don't talk about in our society is how late-term abortions typically occur at hospitals because of, the great risk to women's health when there's a late-term abortion. And so I didn't know that years ago. And that was part of my investigative journey. What I do know is that the abortions were occurring there regularly back then. And there was some conflict from what I've gathered from various people in the community. There was a conflict within, some of the professionals. There was certainly that conflict with the pro-life community who knew that the abortions were taking place. And I don't know what year they stopped performing abortions there. But one of the stories that I'm blessed to tell in my book is that I've actually come face to face with a number of the people who used to pray outside of that hospital back then. And so they are my heroes. Not only that nurse that rushed me to the nursery, those nurses that were fighting for me that wouldn't leave me to die, those people who witnessed outside of that hospital and who were willing to fight for changes to be made, they're my heroes in this too.
I want to thank everyone so much for being here, but let's give a really great round of applause to Melissa Ohden for sharing her very powerful story with us. I don't know about you, but I was reduced to a teary mess here. I was having a really hard time holding it together. If you would like a copy, Melissa has brought copies of her book, You Carried Me. People online can also get on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other websites, so it's available. If you are interested in future FRC events, please go to frc.org/events to get information on that. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great weekend.